So here we go again, and this might be a long video, and it's connecting Einstein in with UFOs. So this person here, Robertson, did the Robertson Panel on UFOs and pointed out a mistake that Einstein made. Wiki says about him, he's Howard Percy Robertson, and he was an American mathematician and physicist known for contributions related to physical cosmology and so forth. And he made important contributions to quantum mechanics, general relativity, and differential geometry. And during the Second World War, he served with the NDRC and the OSRD. And after the war, he was a director of the Weapons System Evaluation Group in the office of the Secretary of Defense from 1950 to 1952. So now what Wiki says about the Robertson Panel. It was a scientific committee which met in January 1953, headed by Howard Robertson. The panel arose from a recommendation to the Intelligence Advisory Committee in December 1952 from the CIA. It was to review the US Air Force investigation into unidentified flying objects, UFOs, Project Blue Book. The panel was briefed on US military activities and intelligence. Hence the report was originally classified secret, later declassified. The Robertson Panel's report concluded that UFOs were not a direct threat to national security, but could pose an indirect threat by overwhelming standard military communications due to public interest in the subject. Most UFO reports, they concluded, could be explained as misidentification of mundane aerial objects, and the remaining minority could in all likelihood be similarly explained with further investigation. And it says about public education on the subject. So this is the person again who dealt with the UFO investigation, and he points out a mistake that Einstein made. I would deal with that and things would just get weirder after that. So from this article, it's entitled Howard Robertson, the Man Who Proved Einstein Wrong. And it says, in 1936, America's foremost physics journal, The Physical Review, received an intriguing paper entitled Do Gravitational Waves Exist? From Einstein and his colleague Rosen. The paper was a follow-up to Einstein's historic breakthrough in 1915 when he revealed equations showing how mass and energy cause space-time to curve and how mass and energy respond to this curvature. In other words, the general theory of relativity. In 1916, Einstein carried on with the theory and made a prediction of the existence of gravitational waves which travel at the speed of light. Einstein and Rosen's paper Do Gravitational Waves Exist?, which they submitted in 1936 to Physical Review. In it they announced their discovery of a fascinating new solution to Einstein's equations, describing a universe with the symmetry of a cylinder and gravitational waves that seemed to ripple through it. Einstein and Rosen decided these waves were a fiction generated by mathematical procedures and were not physically real. So then the issue is what happened to Robertson reviewed the paper from Einstein and Rosen and decided it was an error. He said the gravitational waves described in their paper were real physical waves not mathematical quirks. He asked the authors to think again. Einstein was not happy with this and withdrew his paper from being published with the journal. Soon after this vexing incident, Einstein's assistant, Infeld, who'd replaced Rosen, bumped into Howard Robertson, unaware that Robertson was the anonymous reviewer who had suggested his boss Einstein should think again about gravitational waves. The two began chatting about cosmology in general and about gravitational waves in particular. Robertson persuaded Infeld that Einstein and Rosen were wrong, that their paper needed to be reformulated, and that gravitational waves were physically real. Infeld returned to the master, which is Einstein, who now gave a fair hearing to the arguments he had rejected, then sent to him by the physical review. Howard Robertson then spoke to Einstein with the result that Einstein and Rosen's paper was, this is a quote, completely revised because I'd been able to convince him in the meantime that it proved the opposite of what he thought. And that was from a letter from Howard Robertson to John Tate, editor of the Physical Review. Einstein contacted the Journal of Franklin Institute urgently to correct the mistakes, and that was the journal he was going to publish in instead of the Physical Review. So we can conclude from that Einstein was not perfect. Now, Einstein was friends with this person, and he was also on the Robertson UFO investigation panel. So Einstein probably was in on this panel and knew what was going on with it. The more recent things said about Einstein is from sort of this paper. It's saying that Einstein was given a guided tour of a flying saucer after it crashed at Roswell. So Einstein's involved a lot with all these UFOs and aliens, but whether you believe these claims is arguable. So, recognising we are getting into weird, let's go on to the next video. And this person is asking the question, did Einstein anticipate AATIP? So, as per Wikipedia, AATIP stands for the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and that was a program which was looking into UFOs, but it's in the 21st century, and now they sometimes just call them UAPs, unexplained aerial phenomena. So you get a name change. So although the subject of UFOs is often mocked, some people still take it seriously. If UFOs are craft, then the issue becomes what kind of propulsion do they use and what physics is involved. And the person giving this talk is going to be Simone Hein. And this is what is said about him. He's a director of the Institute for Resonance in Colorado. This institute is devoted to the study of subtle energy science. So we're next bringing Einstein into the UFO issue of exotic propulsion, etc.
Me today, glad that you're here. Well, the question before us is a very interesting idea. did Herr Professor Einstein actually anticipate the idea of exotic extraterrestrial propulsion systems? And I think if we look at the historical record, the answer is clear that he did. And this is new information that I've come upon recently, looking into the history of physics and Einstein and some of the other really founding fathers of physics from the early 1900s. A lot of them had ideas that you and I never heard about. Not the ideas that they're most famous for, but ideas about cosmology, about gravity, laws of large numbers. This applies to Paul Dirac and Ernst Mach, the Austrian philosopher, physicist, and Schrödinger, and Einstein himself.
So the theorizing was abandoned and not generally taught to physics students.
I've talked a lot on this channel about different ways that so-called paranormal phenomena could actually be present in our reality. And I've spent a lot of time talking about Hugh Everett's ideas about what's called the many interacting worlds idea, the idea that there are parallel realities, and the newer idea that some physicists have been creating. So initially from the 50s, we had Hugh Everett with the many worlds interpretation and the relativistic states idea, which is what he called it.
So this is the person, Hugh Everett, and it's in New Scientist. And it says the man who gave us the multiverse. And if you can read it, it's a bit small. Hugh Everett's many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics arose from what must have been the most world-changing drinking session of all time. I.e., they had some sort of party and he thought up this idea. However, you go to a New Scientist letter, it points out from a person called Rene that although Hugh Everett generally credited with the first scientific treatment of the concept of parallel universe, he had been partially anticipated by the 16th century philosopher Giordano Bruno with the concept of multiverse, or you will talk of that as multi-universe. Also, Edgar Allan Poe had a remarkable essay on the subject, and then goes on to mention Boskowitz in the 18th century, who was one of the most versatile scientists of the 18th century, is renowned for his book on the theory philosophy of natural. In that book, Boskowitz developed a theory of matter as consisting of many dimensionless points, with the mutual acceleration of any pair of points being some general function of the distance between them, represented by an oscillatory curve. He considered an oscillatory curve of such a form that there can, so to speak, arise from them any number of universes, each of them being similar to the other or dissimilar, and so forth. So Boskowitz was working at this theory of the multiverse, or multi-universe. And this is what Wikipedia has to say about Boskowitz. He was a philosopher, diplomat, poet, theologian, physicist, astronomer, mathematician, and so forth. And he produced a precursor of atomic theory and made many contributions to astronomy and so forth.
But that all the realities exist simultaneously, and their interaction, not only do they not collapse into nothing, they're all there, but their interaction between parallel realities creates quantum mechanics, which is a really mind-blowing idea in and of itself. The idea that you do have a quantum wave function, but that's the effect of the interaction of lots of parallel realities.
And an interesting video by my friend Dragoslav explains that you can get quantum physics from Voscovich's theory, and it's at that YouTube address. So quantum physics goes back further than just Einstein and Planck. It goes back to the 18th century. So the next relevant bit from Hein is other realities can or could interact with our own reality.
So that's sort of one idea of the way that other phenomena could interact with our reality, could sort of pop in from other realities. There's actually a real scientific theory that says that this is now possible. Even the creators of the many interacting worlds model, Howard Weissman, has said in interviews that it's really not their place to say exactly what these other phenomena might look like, these other realities, just that they would exist, and some of them could be like ours and a lot of them could be very different, and they could intrude or interact, involve themselves in our reality in some way through this many interacting worlds model. I think that's quite a statement for physicists to make, that this could now be possible. You think of all the phenomena we talk about on this channel, you know, UFOs and strange electromagnetic phenomena, balls of light, resonant viewing, picking up distant information. You can see how the idea of parallel realities would matter to that. But there's another way that these phenomena could be in our reality and yet hidden without even resorting to the idea of parallel realities. And this came up at the 2018 IRVA SSE meeting in Las Vegas, where Dr. Halputov brought up his blue shifting idea to explain how these materials work.
So this is what Wiki has about Harold Puthoff. He's an American engineer and parapsychologist, and he co-founded the company To the Stars with Tom DeLonge. Hein talks about metamaterials changing light speed, and ET's probably using metamaterials, skipping a bit and then getting to the next.
Magnetic properties of that material. If you alter those, you actually alter the speed of light. So basically the idea is that these extraterrestrials, the people that are working with these materials, obviously this is like really highly classified stuff, or we know a lot more about it. I mean, Hal only showed us one type of material. I'm sure there are many more. There's got to be lots of different types of materials out there that these craft could be made from. If we look at some of the Valet Nolan research, there's a slide presentation they did in, I think, in Paris a couple of years ago that's online. There's lots of materials that are being examined. These are metamaterials. They're extremely thin, and again, the people I've talked to say they can't be manufactured here on Earth. So the idea is they work by interacting directly with the quantum field by altering their electrical and magnetic fundamental potentials. And that changes what they perceive as the speed of light relative to us. So their speed of light would be different in the craft than our speed of light that we normally perceive. And that would explain, as Hal said in the lecture, and explaining the summary, why a lot of these UFOs appear to be very bluish and very bright, is because their speed of light now is a little different than ours, because they've used these metamaterials to change the epsilon and mu components. So their speed of light is different, so we're slightly slowed down, and what they perceive as normal reality, we would appear to them slightly redshifted, they appear to us slightly blue shifted.
So where does this idea come from? And it comes from Einstein in an idea he abandoned.
Well, at the time I thought, man, that is a really interesting idea. Who came up with that? Well, it turns out that Albert Einstein himself considered a variable speed of light way back in 1907. This is part of the forgotten history of physics, and as I said at the beginning of this presentation, a lot of those, and they're mostly guys back then in physics, a lot of those people back then who founded physics as we know it had alternative ideas that we've never heard about because, as Alexander Unziger has described, I'll put one of his videos here, a scientist from Germany, there's a retrospective narrative, and we're only seeing the endpoint from the point of view of the people telling the story. But these physicists had other ideas that were dismissed. Paul Dirac's idea, the law of large numbers, about ratios, very fundamental constants, the ratio of the width of a proton to the width of the universe turned out to be a certain number, 10 to the 40th power, and the strength of the electrical field.
I.e. things that are not usually taught to physics students. A lot of things are missed out from physics in physics courses. So this is a note of Utzinger. So what happened to Einstein's variable light speed theory?
But it turns out that the variable speed of light that Einstein was looking into, he was going to incorporate in his general theory of relativity. We only got the version of physics where light is at a fixed speed because Einstein was dealing with gravity as a product of curved space-time. But where you could imagine that space-time is flat, then light would take the quickest possible route and it would be curved. And then hence you'd have a variable speed of light. Now the reason this idea didn't go much farther is that Einstein made an error. Because
so Einstein made lots of mistakes, and this book by a physicist points out some of those mistakes. Unfortunately, sometimes there's a hardcore of Einstein's supporters that don't want to accept those mistakes.
C, the speed of light, equals frequency by wavelength. And at the time itself was measured, speed of light, with clocks. So they weren't looking at wavelength, they were just looking at frequency, according to Alexander Unziger. And so and you can see this in the early papers that Einstein wrote, 1907, 1911. He was looking at variable speed of light. When they did the computations, looking at the gravitational potential of the universe as they understood it at the time, and light, it was off by a factor, a certain factor of around 0.87. And they couldn't quite figure this out. And again, even when Einstein was working with other physicists on this, they made the same mistake. And so he sort of abandoned the idea of the variable speed of light, and it wasn't until Robert Dicke, the American astrophysicist, corrected this error in, I believe, 1957, that they found out that Einstein hadn't looked at the entire, equation for C equals wavelength times frequency. He was just looking at frequency. So if you had corrected for the error, the variable speed of light would have been something that was incorporated with physics. And
so this is what Wikipedia has to say about the person. It's a Robert Henry Dicke. He was an American astronomer and physicist who made important contributions to the fields of astrophysics and so forth. So Einstein's variable light speed theory was corrected by him, but still it's not something generally taught to physics students. Hein then goes on to talk about Hubble's observations, after which he gets back to extraterrestrials, ETs.
Well, it turns out that other physicists, Albert Einstein, they were looking into the idea of the variable speed of light as a direct function of, as we said in the beginning, epsilon and mu. And so the variable speed of light would suggest, if other civilizations have figured this out, even civilizations here on Earth, we might not even...
i.e. what he means alien civilizations here on Earth and in our solar system all around us.
Perceive them anymore. And that's really the implication of all this, is besides parallel realities as a source for some of these really interesting phenomena that we study here interacting with us, even within our own reality, not resorting to parallel realities, but even in our own world, you could have entities operating at other frequencies, at slightly different frequencies. If the frequency was just changed a little bit, they would appear blue shifted, as many UFOs do, and they could give you a actual burn, as we found out from Gary, who we've interviewed on this channel, the former missile security guard from Minot in the 1970s, who said, you know, it's such a bright bluish object, and he was burned on the right side as his colleague in the truck at the time, from the security alert team that they were part of. So we can kind of see the evidence sort of fits this idea, and if you kept shifting these fundamental constants enough, the speed of light would change so much for the occupants in these vehicles, they might actually disappear. They might be invisible to us. They might have a cloaking capability. So perhaps there's entities amongst us right now that we don't see, we don't even perceive, because their speed of light is different than our speed of light. And it would also go a long way to explaining why all these UFOs and related phenomena, balls of light, Bigfoot, things like this, seem to affect people's cars, radios, and the like, and why electronics is affected in such a strange way by being around these phenomena, because they're electrical, they're magnetic, they're electromagnetic, and those fundamental constants are being altered by this type of technology. So anyway, those are my thoughts on this, and I think, again, it's really interesting that physicists were looking at these ideas, I think, in summation, a long time ago. But for some reason, you know, slight mistakes were made at the time, and it got pushed off to the side. We never heard about it in our formal idea of physics. But I think it's very interesting that they thought about some of these ideas. They would have anticipated the way that we're coming to believe that some UFO craft operate. And I think that's really exciting, because instead of facing the criticism that you've probably heard, there's no science behind this, you know, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, there is science behind it, and the physicists 100 years ago were already considering that physics, even if it didn't develop.
So he says 100 years, but it's even longer than that. Boskowitz was over 200 years ago. So what you got is physics going back hundreds of years, and it's not being taught to physics students at university in general. It's just being missed out, and they're treating it as abandoned most of the time. But that is the connection to the physics behind UFOs and so forth. So finish, thank you. That's the end. The video was a bit longer than I was hoping. I normally like to keep it shorter than this, but it's hopefully not too long.